Invasive species are one of the most important biological problems we have on the planet today. For most of human history, plants have been moved around the planet alongside human populations, sometimes because maybe they make good plants for a garden, sometimes because they're good crop species, and sometimes because they hitch a ride in a transport vehicle, whether that's a horse or a shoe or a plane. Not all species are invasive, but some species, when they're introduced to a new environment, take over aggressively, displacing native species, creating economic or environmental harm, and those are the ones we worry about as invasive species. So in this video, we're going to take a look at a particular invasive species called tamarisk in the western US, and how it's possible to actually use natural biological relationships through biocontrol to try to regulate this pest species.
In this video, we'll look at what an invasive species is and why these species pose a risk to plant and animal communities. We'll look at how the absence of natural predators and herbivores can allow the expansion of invasive organisms. And finally, we'll look at how the natural relationships between organisms like this can be exploited for the biocontrol of invasive species. In particular, we'll look at a specific case study of tamarisk, an invasive tree species that has taken over the banks of many western waterways. Tamarisk, also called salt cedar, is an invasive species. An invasive species is a non-native species that causes some type of economic or environmental harm once it's introduced. Typically, invasive species are introduced from some other location and then spread rapidly in their new environments, causing harm to the ecosystem, maybe displacing native populations, and potentially causing other impacts. There are a number of invasive species that were originally introduced because they look nice in gardens. In the spring, tamarisk blooms with a beautiful pink flower, and this is why it was introduced to the United States from Eurasia in the early 1800s as an ornamental plant for gardens. Once introduced, it started to take off in a unique setting of riverbanks along many western U.S. riverways like the San Juan River shown in this photo. Tamarisk has a very rapid growth rate. It can grow 9 to 12 feet in a single growing season. It can tolerate high temperatures, survive flooding, and it grows well in salty soils. All of these factors put together made it exceptionally successful along the banks of large western rivers. And it grows so quickly that it can displace willow or cottonwoods that would normally be occurring along the banks of rivers. And once it gets going, it creates very dense thickets, often a few meters deep along the riverbanks. For anyone who spends time rafting or hiking near western rivers, tamarisk is a very common sight and something that you will have noticed in the past. One of the other major issues with tamarisk is that it has a very high evapotranspiration rate. Evapotranspiration is a movement of water from soils or surrounding areas into roots, up through a plant, and out through small holes in leaves called stomates. Different plants have different rates of evapotranspiration, and as it turns out, the tamarisk needs a lot of water and has very high evapotranspiration. In a large river like this one, like the San Juan here in the picture, the roots from the vegetation on the banks extend out into the sediments under the river and pull water into the vegetation from these settings. The tamarisk tends to use more water than native plants, and when that water is pulled out of the river, it means there's less to go downstream. This particular river empties into Lake Powell, which is part of the Colorado River catchment that stores water for use in Arizona, Nevada, and California. It's often very difficult to estimate the environmental and economic costs of invasive species, but for tamarisk, one estimate placed the economic value from lost water somewhere between $169 and $362 million per year. For this reason, and because tamarisk changes the nature of these rivers for recreationalists and for native species, there has been a great interest in trying to find ways to return these western waterways to their pre-invasion states. This brings us to the idea of biocontrol, which is the use of one biological organism to control the density or spread of another. With invasive species, the idea of biocontrol came from a basic idea in community biology. Virtually every species on the planet has some kind of native herbivore or predator, and these relationships help keep species from growing too quickly. When a species like tamarisk is imported into a native habitat, or new native habitat, the native herbivores that used to eat this species are often left behind, and this is one of the reasons that tamarisk has been able to grow so quickly in the United States. The tamarisk we see in the United States originated in Eurasia, And there are a number of beetles that aggressively feed on this tree in its native habitat, but no similar herbivores in the United States. So the idea of biocontrol is to introduce one of these beetles to the U.S. in the hopes that it can reduce the growth of tamarisk. These types of experiments started in the late 1960s, and by the early 2000s, a particular beetle had been identified as a potential biocontrol measure for tamarisk. Now, there are major risks with introducing yet another non-native species to a new environment. And so prior to widespread introduction, a number of federal agencies carried out a series of tests to determine whether or not this beetle would spread beyond tamarisk and become a pest for other plant populations. These tests suggested it would not, and soon thereafter was introduced as a biocontrol measure for tamarisk. The map on this page is from a forum in Grand Junction, Colorado in 2016 and shows the distribution of introduced beetles along western riverways at this time. If you were to go along the Colorado River or any of the tributaries to the river now, you'll see large areas of dead tamarisk pretty much everywhere you look. And overall in this region, tamarisk density has been reduced dramatically. And like many forms of biocontrol, these beetles will not completely remove tamarisk from the rivers, but they will keep the density much less abundant than it once was. This map from the Tamarisk Coalition shows a remarkable spread of the tamarisk beetle over time. The red dots are from 2007 and show where it was introduced near Grand Junction. The orange dots are from 2008 and 2009, the green dots are from 2011, and the purple dots are from 2013 and 14. So in just 7 years, the beetle moved along all of these rivers throughout the southwestern U.S., and this rapid spread explains part of the reason that there's been such a major change in tamarisk populations in these areas over this time period. The tamarisk example is one of the most interesting cases of biocontrol, and so far the negative impacts of this effort appear to be relatively small. In general, biocontrol is controversial because it's so difficult to predict the effects of these types of species introductions, and because it's hard to prevent all of the potential negative consequences that might occur. In the case of tamarisk, some of the negative impacts of biocontrol are under the reduction in habitat for birds because of the loss of vegetation, potential increases in bank erosion, but there are also positives, like a reduction in fire risk and intensity in some of these locations. To summarize, we know that invasive species are non-negative organisms that can cause economic and/or environmental damage. One reason why these species can grow so quickly is sometimes the absence of natural predators or herbivores. Without these natural checks on growth, these organisms can grow faster and expand to encompass a broader range than would otherwise be possible. In biocontrol, the idea is to introduce some of these natural checks on organism growth in the hopes of reducing the impacts of these non-native species on the native species and the natural ecosystems in an area. The tamarisk example is a case where this actually worked pretty well, and there are other cases where it also has been successful.